Welcome everyone to our weekly webinar. Thank you so much for joining. As always, it's a privilege to be here. Let's spend an hour or so today talking about federal probation, how to prepare for it, regardless of where you are in the journey. The earlier you begin to prepare, the better. There are people in our community who are currently on federal probation. So as you know, and as people occasionally text Scott, the less Justin talks, the better. So if you're on federal probation, Scott Seek, Joseph DiGregorio is in our community, on our team, going to speak. If you're on federal probation and you can chime in a way that provides value and helps people understand the complexities of federal probation, things that have worked well for you, perhaps in retrospect, things that you could have done differently, we want to hear them because we are a community and we're here to help. As a reminder, if anyone would like a digital copy of Earning Freedom, Michael Santos's book, it's free, have nothing to sell you here. Simply directly message Scott. He will get your email. He'll then send you the book via either Audible or another digital file of what we have. But I encourage you, as you're going through the system, to prepare. A couple of days ago, I received a call from a banker who served 27 months in prison, and he was going on and on that he's out of prison, but now he's in this new prison outside of it. And I said, we've got to maintain some perspective. I'm not diminishing your 27 months, but if Michael can conquer 26 straight years in prison, come home and thrive, you can do it over 27 months. The question is, what choices did you make in prison? What could you have done differently? And what can you do moving forward? We don't want any of you to feel like you're in a jail outside of prison. That's miserable. Let your short sentence be a short sentence. But to the extent that you can prepare now, it will be easier. To that end, before we get going, has anyone had an opportunity to spend a few more minutes on the Prison Professor Talent website? I know we went through it last week. Has anyone read Michael's blogs? Is there anyone that spent a few minutes on it who's contemplated creating a profile to memorialize their journey? Is there anyone here? Linda, you did? Okay, Linda's muted. That's
okay. Now I'm unmuted.
Go ahead.
No, what I wanted to say is I want to take what I did write both in prison, because I did actually correspond quite a bit with Michael and especially Carol, and memorialize it and summarize it. I'm going through my notes now.
Good. So I encourage all of you to spend a few minutes every day, if you can, understanding Prison Professor's Talent, and really something that Michael's been my partner for 14 years. Scott was a client. He leads our sales team. You have interacted. Many of you have interacted with him. I am learning every day, just like all of you. So Scott, do you see on the left where it says release plans and iterative release plan?
I do.
Do me a favor, Scott, as I nearly choke here. We occasionally have some calls with people who will say, hey, I wrote this release plan either by myself or with your team. So I'm going to give this to a case manager, and this is going to convince them to let me out of jail. Can you touch on the importance of the release plan, but also explain that it is not a get out of jail free card? And then I'm going to go through this blog.
Sure. And I'm glad Justin brought this up, because I have received this call many times recently. And I think the challenge is people think I've put in this work before I go to prison, and I have this release plan that documents what I'm doing to make amends and what my plans are with my future and why I may be worthy of leniency. But they forget that it is indeed iterative. It's about, what are you doing with your time while you are away? What programming are you taking? What books are you reading? How are you being productive? How are you preparing for the life that you want to live? And for anyone on the webinar today who's contemplating making a release plan, remember that the bulk of the work happens when you are in prison, right? And it continues when you're in the halfway house, and it continues when you're on probation. As Michael would always tell me, you have to continue proving why you are worthy of leniency. And that can start with documenting the journey, how you're making amends, and what your plans are for the future. So it is by no means a one-time document that then goes to work for you. You have to continue at it.
Scott, can you quickly speak to the mechanics? So if you're in prison, how do you actually prepare it and keep this? Do you just write it by hand and then keep it in your locker?
That's a great question, Evan. And we have people do it several ways. I personally enjoyed using the email system, TrueLinks. And what you can do is you can write on that. It is the closest thing you'll have to Microsoft Word inside a facility. I would save the emails I wrote as a draft, and then you can simply print that page out and then attach that to your release plan. Or you could send it to family who could print it via Microsoft Word and then mail it back to you. And I know that sounds highly inefficient, but it almost becomes one of the joys of prison in terms of things move slow, but when you work within those limitations and you're patient, you can get a lot done.
Got it. So there are printers at prison where you can print things off?
There are. It is 5 cents a page, and you can print off the emails that you receive.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Justin?
Thank you. I'm going to put up a link to a podcast I filmed. I actually read this blog and I offered insights for all of you on the release plan. So I'll put up a link to the White Collar Advice podcast. It's about 8 minutes, the one that I just filmed. I read it and offered insights. In this blog that Michael put up on Prison Professor Talent, you hear him writing about building his release plan after the judge convicted him the jury convicted him in 1987. He goes back to the cell. The guard says, "What happens?" He says, "I'm convicted." This nice guard brings him some books, and he's reading philosophy, Viktor Frankl, Nelson Mandela. And Michael said, "I'm going to write my release plan." He did this in 1987 before it is becoming a buzzword in the BOP, thanks to our work. He did it in 1987. But as you'll see, the initial plan was, what's the first 10 years look like? I want to earn academic credentials. I want to contribute to society. I want to build a support network. That was the goal for his first 10 years in prison. None of you are getting 26 years in federal prison. Therefore, what if your sentence is 18 months? My 18-month plan was very simple. In my release plan, and I wanted to document how I would avoid problems. I wanted to grow my network, so I had an opportunity to get a job in the halfway house, which I knew would enable me to get passes. I wanted to create a record to my case manager with hopes that I could get as much time in the halfway house as possible. That was my initial release plan. So if you have created your release plan and you're articulating your goals, that is just a start. The real work is the follow-up and the growth and how you build to it. So we call this an iterative process because you're going to show in this plan, and questions that you should answer are exactly what Michael answered. What influenced you to go to prison? What were the reasons behind it? How did your crime influence others? How are you working to make amends? What challenges are you currently facing? We got a call from someone, it's 115 degrees at Pensacola. They're hot, they're concerned about their health. It's tough for them to pursue some goals right now because they're concerned about staying alive. Okay, the plan changes as your life evolves in federal prison. What progress are you making? The plan has to adjust over time. When I was done with probation, my release plan changed because I was done with the government watching every move that I had made. If you truly want to prepare, please spend a few minutes every day, Scott and I do, reading the daily journal at Prison Professor's Talent. You'll see how the plan has to grow, and you'll understand why you just don't produce it, hand it to a case manager and expect them to say, "Wow, this is fantastic. You want a year in the halfway house, right? No problem, here it is." But believing that is like believing McDonald's doesn't want you to eat cheeseburgers. It's naive. We want you to approach it differently, but it has to grow. Scott Carper, Donald's son, he said, "I'm going to document the journey through prison." He did it one time. You know what a lot of people think? He'll grow tired of it. It's exhausting. It's too much work. But I think he's into 49 newsletters now, Don? Clearly, it's growing, it's documented. And the beauty is you see his growth from the last newsletter all the way to the first, and all of the trauma, good and bad in between. His release plan is out there for the world to read and digest. You've got to do the same thing, presuming you want what everyone wants, not just getting out earlier, the shortest sentence, more liberty on probation, which is some of what we're going to discuss today. Before we transition to that topic, are there any questions about Prison Professor Talent, reading the daily journal, or what we've just covered about the release plan? Anything at all? None? Okay, good. We are going to transition to federal probation. I'd love someone to chime in and tell me what they think the role of the probation officer is. Joseph, you just started probation. Everyone unmute yourself, jump in. What is the role of the probation officer with whom you may meet in the house? You'll probably meet in the halfway house. And of course, you should be communicating with that person from prison. Can someone chime in and tell me what they think their role is?
To make sure you're compliant with the conditions of your release.
Anyone else? Because I would argue most people are compliant with the conditions of their release. That's true. But how can you position yourself right out of the gate to begin getting more liberties, as I did, as Scott Laney did, as Joseph DiGregorio did? Are there any things that you think you could do when you meet with that probation officer to advance your agenda at that first meeting?
I don't know about the first. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Say you try to anticipate what they're going to want to know to make their job easy, and you try to give them more than they need until they come to understand that you're trying to make their job easy, and it helps them relax.
Can someone tell me how, I agree with everything you just said. So how do you do that? So you want to,
So I just met on Monday with my probation officer. I just started my 3 years of supervised release. He had already visited my home while I was in the institution. He came to my house in January, and the end of January, he approved the home, and I was on the ankle monitor from March 21st until July 10th. I, of course, reported to the probation. You have 72 hours to report to your probation officer once you get out of the halfway house or off home confinement. And I called him right away. He said, meet me next Monday, so-and-so at this office. So I said, okay, great. I followed up with that with an email because he texted it to me because I wanted to have a trail of it. And I emailed him back saying, you know, look forward to meeting you. Just to confirm, I'm going to be meeting you here, so-and-so, this Monday, you know, July 17th. He said yes. So I was preparing through a few things. The judgment in the criminal case that has all your supervised release, you know, mine is 3 parts. I have mandatory conditions, I got standard conditions, and I have it right here. And the special conditions of supervision. Everyone's probably going to be unique to his or her case. You know, mine, I have restitution, and, you know, so I studied it. You know, I pulled those pages out, went over any questions I wanted to go over with him. He said to be there between 8:30 and 10:30. I was there at 8:15. He was there already. He said he appreciated that. I was wearing a suit with no tie. Other people in the office were there with, you know, shorts and T-shirts on. And, you know, I didn't want to, you know, dress like that. There's a few things. I was preparing the whole week, right, leading up to it. I wanted to go over all my health issues. I got letters from my doctors, letters for employment. I brought my release plan to the officer. I printed it out, brought it to him, went over all my talking points in the release plan. I didn't just hand it to him. I was talking to him for about an hour and a half. So at first you sit there and he's going to go over your mandatory conditions, and he's just going to read it off to you, and you got to sign a paper saying you understand it. And then you're allowed to speak, and then you go over everything that you want to go over. I brought everything with me. I mean, I brought my folder was this big. I brought stuff over for my health, all my medication list, my doctor's appointments that are coming up, because I have a lot in Manhattan. I'm in New Jersey. And, you know, he told me when I met him that I'm not allowed to leave the state for 90 days, right? There was a probation period. He says, but if you have doctor's appointments, that's fine. You could leave it. Just email me everything. Email me your appointments. He goes, I'm not going to respond to you. He says, but the only time you have to wait for a response is if you're traveling and you're going to be away for a while. I said, okay, fine. He drug tested me. And, you know, he said just one thing. He says, we need to maintain an open communication. I said, absolutely. We're going to have open flow of dialogue. He says, answer your phone every time I call it. He says, I'm going to be showing up your house unexpectedly. He said, of course, avoid any criminal activity, because if you get arrested on supervised release, it's a double charge. You get charged for violating and you get charged for the crime you got arrested for. So much worse than not being on, just getting arrested. And that's not going to happen anyway. To put anything with bank documents, financials, credit cards that you're going to be using, debit cards, they want to know. And just really, they don't want, I could see he doesn't want to be bothered a lot because they have to do paperwork with everything that you suggest to him? And he said, you are very prepared, Joseph. I see this, I was like, so, after I was talking about everything, he said to me, I don't see us having any problems. He goes, I could already see that. I said, so do I have to report here? It's an hour away where I went to see him. So he says, no, he says, you might have to come here once a year. He goes, you might not have to come in here at all. So I said, okay, great. And I left there that day. Very, very, it was very nice. So this morning at 9 a.m., he rings my bell. First home visit today. Met him Monday. Here he is at my house. And came in, very nice. I welcomed him at the door. Wanted to just look around. He wasn't really prying into anything, but I opened everything. I opened the linen closet for him. I opened the car. He says, no, you don't have to do that, Joseph. I was like, no, yeah, take a look. Everything you want to see. He didn't even want to step into the bedroom. I said, please. So my wife was there. She was sitting at the table. We offered him coffee, sit down if he wants anything. He says, no, that's good. Thank you so much. He says, I might come back next month. So, my wife said to him, I understand he's on this 90-day probationary period just to leave the state, but we have all our family in New York and we're in New Jersey. And, he hasn't seen his mom and dad, and his whole family's in New York. My whole family is. He says, can we let you know and just email a day before we're going to go? He says, yeah, sure. No problem. Don't worry about the 90 days. So, they're, of course, they treat everyone the same initially, but then they see who's who and you can separate yourself from all of them. So I just emailed him today, my doctor's appointment for tomorrow. And, it seems, of course, being in prison and going on the bracelet and going on supervised release, you're able to spread your wings a lot now. But definitely, he just wanted he made it a sense to, of course, don't fail any drug tests and to respect the boundaries, but to understand the terms and to really maintain open communication.
Before I turn it over to questions and come back to Joseph, thank you. Joseph did some things leading up to the interview that some people do, and some people don't do. So someone mentioned earlier, you want to be compliant, you want to be honest. What are ways that you can demonstrate why you're worthy of leniency? Michael Santos interviewed Chris Maloney, the former chief of probation, and he said, we have a perception of you as a defendant based on the sentence, the judgment and commitment order, but also the probation report. And he said the first thing a probation officer will review is the probation report. And it can be many years before sitting for the PSR and by the time you shake hands with your probation officer. And many of you weren't prepared or don't agree with your probation report as it paints a narrative of you that you don't agree with. So what we have learned, what Michael Santos encouraged me to do from federal prison was write letters to your probation officer. It doesn't take long. Buy a copy card in the commissary, write a letter. Joanne, your son's in prison. He should be doing this. Buy a copy card in the commissary, write it, make a copy, keep one. Many of you are going to say, I don't know who my probation officer is. What do I do? Send it to the district, send it to the office. He or she may get it or not. You bring a copy with you when you meet them and say, I've been writing to you extensively while in prison. I don't know if you received it. Here are the copies and here's my release plan. Isaiah Murrow, my probation officer, said, I got your letters. Thank you. It's part of the reason he allowed me to work with justice impacted people day one when everyone in prison said it's never going to happen. So if you want more leniency, if you want to have a greater ability to travel, get off probation early, it helps if you get off to a good start. And rather than going to the meeting and talking about all you did in prison in sort of a promotional self-aggrandizing way, it's better if you say, here's the record that I built in prison. Here's my release plan. I know you're busy, but I'd be so grateful if you would keep it as a part of my file. That could include an employment letter that should be drafted. You should have several jobs when you meet with the probation officer because it shows how seriously you take it. Joseph did that. He documented his journey through prison. He had his narrative, he had letters, and he was prepared to give it to his probation officer, including all health issues and ailments. It's kind of like the probation interview that you're doing again before sentencing, but because you've been through so much, and many of you weren't prepared for the probation interview, it's a chance for you. It's like a second chance because this person is going to oversee you most likely for 3 years. I have more to say on that before I do. I want to turn it in. Patty, welcome. Please unmute yourself and lower your hand. Happy to answer your question.
I was just going to share my experience with probation. I don't really have a question.
Yeah, please, as succinctly as you can. We'd love to learn from you. Thank you.
Sure. So I've been on probation for 60 days and I did my release plan with, before I actually went in, I had an extremely short sentence at camp. I was only there 3.5 months. So I gave it to my case manager. My case manager gave it to my PO. My PO actually went to my house before I got out, visited with my husband. My husband gave him a copy of it. So he got it like 3 times. And then when I got home, he met with me for like 2 hours at my home. We talked about everything. He told me his expectations. I told him I'm very communicative. I will check in with you. You won't have to check in with me. And I've been doing that. And I've actually been able to get 2 vacations approved, one in the state out of the district and one across the country within 60 days. He's been very lenient with me because I've just been so honest and open with him. So the communication part is extremely, extremely important. I check in with him before he has to check in with me. I just check in with him like once a week. I send him a text, I call him, I tell him everything's going well, job's going good, relationships are going good, therapy's going good. And he has commented that he just really appreciates that because normally he has to track people down. So that's just been my experience.
Thank you for sharing. I know there were people that I used to, sometimes I joke, run to Michael and say, someone saw me writing a letter to my probation officer. They're calling me crazy and kind of mocking me. And he's like, you can do your own thing or you can be influenced by other people. If I were you, I'd build your plan. I'd document it and I'd share it with people who are going to determine what happens to you. And I said, good idea. And I sent it. So it's sort of like we express to people, like when you have your probation interview, if you can get the narrative to your probation officer, that's like 80% of the interview. We continue to have people in our community.
Hi, Gordon Driver checking in.
If you can mute yourself while we're speaking, we continue to have people say, wow, my probation officer said this is the best narrative he ever read. He's going to put it in the report. And he thanked me for doing so much of his job for him because he already knows so much about me. It was a wonderful interview. Well, if that helps for the probation interview, and if we know that can impact this sentence, does it make sense that you should then influence the probation officer with that same copy? Edit your narrative, build it into the plan. Edit your character reference letters, build it into the plan. Write your book reports, build it into the plan. If you have a website like Scott Laney did, or if you're doing it through Prison Professor Talent, share your content with your probation officer. I can assure you they're Googling you. I know they're Googling you. They're looking at what you have done and what you were doing, and you can let your DOJ releases come up, or you can let them see the record that you're building. That's how you position yourself for the first meeting. 99% of the work should be done by the time you shake your hand. If not, they're going to say, I just met you. I don't know you. I've read your probation report. It says that you scam people for $2.5 million. Your judge gave you 4 years. Let's just reassess in 6 months. You're not going anywhere. You're not traveling. You're not doing it. That's usually what happens if they don't know enough about you. And that's evidenced by what Chris Maloney told Michael Santos. Maloney told Santos, you, Michael, a dude that served 26 years in prison, I would expect to have no network, no job, no money, no marriage, no career. But because you had that, it's the reason Michael had liberties the day that he was released. 99% of the work should be done the day that you show up. Joseph did it, Scott Laney did it, and others did it. It's just work you have to do every day. 5 or 10 minutes a day, go to Prison Professor's Talent, read Michael's blog to see what a methodical plan truly looks like. Now, Nancy, thank you. Please lower your hand and unmute yourself. We welcome your contribution.
I'm on probation. I've been on probation 18 months. I was in prison for 42 months, home confinement 18 months. Again, I'm on 18 months of probation. I've asked several times for an early release. I have an enormous amount of restitution. So he said, we're not even going to apply for that. I've never met my probation officer. I'm on my 5th one at this point in time. They've never come to my house. So depending on what state and where you are, and if you're federal or state, you may not get it. I have a friend in Arizona who had a probation officer that checked her phone, checked her bank, checked where she was working, just basically crawled up her rump to find out where she was, what she was doing. My probation officer hasn't done any of that. I've talked to him a handful of times, and that's it.
So just like a case manager in prison, when I was in prison, we had Miss Mann, who was a phenomenal case manager. She's like, come in, what's happening? The other case manager, whose name I won't mention, was like, what are you doing? What do you want? Get out. two totally different human beings who responded. Scott Seek has shared what he saw at Coleman. We have people in prison right now who are told, they walk in with their release plan and the case manager says, this is terrific, go teach this class. They're two totally different people. My probation officer was very nice, but he said to me the same thing, Nancy. He said, you owe money, and unless you paid in full before you're done, there's no chance I'm going to suggest that you get off probation early. You can apply. It'd be nice to have the judge, your probation officer recommend it. Many will say, I'm going to deny, recommend it, offer no opinion. Of course, it's up to the judge. But he had said to me, I suspect the judge will respect my opinion. Don't ask if you owe money. It's not going to happen. Some people do, however. Dr. Nate Schott from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Many of you know Dr. Schott. He got a 33-month sentence in Montgomery. He was home in 10 months. He still owed restitution, and they let him off probation after about 18 months. It's subjective. It's possible. What we suggest is you do all you can to prepare, go all in, because if you do that work, maybe it lets you off probation early, maybe it doesn't. But that record you're building is frankly going to be more important when you're done with prison, right? Go ahead.
The other thing on this is I owe the federal government. They take a certain percentage of money out of my Social Security every month. I'm still at a loss of why I can't get off this probation early, because I'm stuck with them taking money out of my Social Security for the next 20 years. So I'm kind of taken aback by that. Since the government's taking my money from a federally funded program, why can't I get off probation?
Yes, these are good questions we won't dive into now, other than to say, those of you should know they can and will take your Social Security and things like that. It's 10%, correct?
I believe mine's 15%.
Okay, so I've seen 10. I've seen it used to be 10%. But
And I also owe the government, since I have this huge restitution, they made me file taxes. So I owe income taxes on that restitution to boot. So I owe the IRS and the federal government. The IRS can't touch me because they're both federal entities, and they can still only take 15% of what I make from the government.
Got it. So we're going to come over to some questions in a minute. I want you to know, at my first probation interview, he said, do you ever plan to travel? And I said, I sure hope so. He said, where will you be traveling? I said, I hope to get speaking engagements where people will pay me to speak. He said, about what? I told him, he said, good luck people paying you for that, but okay. Then I said, there is a chance I may need to travel to see consulting clients. And again, everyone in prison said, not only will he not let you do this work, he will never let you meet with a felon in person. And because of the release plan and the work, he said, okay, fine, I will put you on a short lease. But if there are any problems, and if you do not bring in any money to pay your restitution, you're going to go continue to pick up phones, which is what I did for 3 months in the halfway house. Now, I know travel requests have probably gone online since I was on probation, but I just want to share with you the evidence that I submitted. Scott, can you see my travel request here on the left?
I can.
Okay, so this is, I'm sure it's online now, but this is what I filled out. Basic page, where am I going to be staying? I'm going to share with you the only thing my probation officer cared about, because he never let me travel once for personal. It always had to be work related. Joseph, maybe you can go from Jersey to New York and see family. Maybe. I hope that happens. He said to me, there will not be one personal travel request while you're on probation. You can, however, travel for work. I want at least 48 hours notice. So this was a travel request I submitted the 24th of October, 2010. Forgive my terrible writing. And on here, I said where I'm departing from, when I'm returning, what I'm doing. I'm speaking at an accounting conference in New Jersey, where I'm staying, the airline, and everything. This never would have been approved unless I provided evidence to him from the event organizer what I was doing. So I would tell every event organizer, and by the way, it's a great way to ensure that you get paid on probation. If they ask you to speak for free, you'll say, my probation officer won't let me travel unless I'm getting paid. So I would have the organizer write me a letter. As you know, I am one of the persons in charge of putting together a seminar at Ampner Eisner, an accounting firm with 600 people. We are thrilled to have you for our afternoon speaker. This is all my probation officer cared about. Per our agreement, we are prepared to pay you an honorarium of $2,500 plus travel and hotel expenses. Once he saw that on their email, he never once reached out to them. He never confirmed that they were paying me, but every travel request was approved. If I submitted evidence that I was getting paid, and then I began to get smart. If I had an event on Friday in New York, I'd fly out on Tuesday, and I take a meeting on Wednesday at a business school or see a client, another one on Thursday, so I can network and get out of Los Angeles for 4 days while on probation. So while technically there was no personal stuff, I had a lot of personal interactions with friends while I was in New York and elsewhere. Get creative, but you've got to provide income, or it's got to be work related. So if you are on probation and you're a salesman and it is part of your job to leave town, your boss will need to write a letter articulating why you're leaving. This is part of your daily responsibilities and tasks. And if you have questions, you can check in with me 24 hours a day. That's the way you can travel on probation and really feel as if you have freedom. Scott Laney, to that end, right when you started probation, as I understood it, you flew from Idaho to my home here in California. What was that process like with your probation officer to travel?
I think that it was more of a long-term kind of global approach to it. Not, I want to go do this weekend, but here's how I'm reintegrating. Here are my plans for the future. Here's how this is going to benefit me moving forward. And I have to say, she was and has been exceptionally reasonable with me.
I would agree with that by virtue of letting you come out so quickly. Now let's jump to some questions. Mike, good to see you. If you can lower on Mike Protract, your question, I believe you're on probation as well. Please contribute.
Yeah. No question. It's been 7 months, and my guidance is be honest, be respectful, and be precise. And it's so easy. All I have to do is I get a quarterly visit, and I get notified 2 weeks out when she's going to show up. And I've been able to travel. No headaches, no muss, no fuss.
I love hearing that. Unfortunately, that isn't the case for everyone. I see some other hands up, please. Joseph, if you can unmute yourself.
Yes, did they object to you working for yourself?
Right. So that's something we've covered before with John Gustin. We'll cover it again. I was able to work for myself. It all comes down to the record that you have built. And here's 2 analogies that a probation officer had given to me. You show up on probation, you owe money. Let's not forget what the government cares about. The victims, the judge's sentence, they want to ensure the payments are going to be made. So if you have no evidence to give this probation officer and say, hey, I want to be an entrepreneur, I have this idea, can I do it? He's going to say the same thing he said to me. Well, what's the plan? Is there a market for it? Who's going to pay you? Why are you worthy of it? What record have you built that will compel me to say yes? So of course, Joseph, if you've built a record that shows why you're an entrepreneur, there's a track record, or you've invested the time in prison by way of your release plan or other assets that you've created. Of course, I created Lessons from Prison with Michael in prison, but whether it's a book, a blog, a website, a release plan, if you're not given an asset to them, here's what you're going to be told. Ain't no chance. Go to Mickey D's, go to KFC, get a minimum wage job because we want $100 a month going to restitution. So the answer to the question is, it's up to you. If you want to be an entrepreneur, you'll do the work, you'll spend time. I'd go to Prison Professor Talent, read the blog, it's all free, and see the plan you need to build for that eventual meeting that could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. I can tell you by the work that I did in prison, having my probation officer say yes, it changed my life because I've been in this game since the 16th of August, 2009, when my probation officer said yes. If not, I'd have been doing many things to pay the bills and live, and we wouldn't be on this webinar today. So the answer is yes. If you want it badly enough, you'll build that record. If not, if you put it off, I'll get around to it as so many people do. The answer is no. I share that story of a case manager who's on these webinars, and she reached out to me secretly, and she's like, people in prison, I recognize from the webinar, they've addressed it. They come to me. They didn't do anything you suggest they do. Why? I don't know. It's like the person who might buy an exercise bike and they rest their clothes on it. Does no good if you come here, but you don't do the work. You're wasting time, hours and years. Okay, any other question? Melinda, it's good to see you. Melinda's on the webinar now. Please ask your question, Melinda.
I wanted to ask if the probation officer who did my PSR, is that the same probation I will have when I leave? It's not? Okay.
It will be a different person, but as Chris Maloney told Michael Santos, the first thing they're really trained to do is to look at the probation report. And that doesn't mean they can't call them and say, hey, I have Melinda as I'm overseeing her. What was she like? She's really developed this beautiful record while her time in prison. She's articulated her plans. Is that consistent with the person that you interviewed? Yes, no, maybe. So absolutely they could reach out. It wouldn't be hard. But so it's a different person, but they're going to rely heavily on the probation report that was written. And again, many of you like and do not like that probation report. You've got to build it, but it will be a different person. You're cultivating relationships with all of these stakeholders throughout the whole journey, right? And it's important you embrace that and build upon that record. I share the story of someone in our community. The sentencing was here in Santa Ana in front of Judge Carter or Carney. Either way, they can be mean. And they basically said, like, you're a criminal and you're a risk to the community, and I'm taking you into custody, and I'm not sure you can change. And it's like, wow, that was difficult to hear. So rather than run from it, this person in prison is essentially building a release plan to the judge that says, I know this is your perception of me, and I can understand why you feel that way, especially because I wasn't totally compliant on pretrial. He continued to work in an industry when the judge told him not to. That's a no-no. But he said, here's what I'm doing to become better. Here's the book I read. And he wrote a book report about earning freedom. Here's programming that I'm participating in. I know I need to build a new record, Your Honor. Take what they give you, put it into your release plan, and share it. Why? Chris Maloney told Michael Santos, it makes sense for you to share the release plan with your judge. They will follow you. And many judges have told defendants at sentencing, I want you to come and see me when you're out of prison. I will consider early termination. I wish you well, make good decisions. Judge Carter specifically says that here in Santa Ana. You have opportunities to use this time well. Some do, some don't. When I went to prison, I wasted several months until Michael got me on track. We don't want any of you to waste one day. Gina, your question.
Just a statement that my narrative was used for my pre-sentence report. And he basically copied and pasted my statements, put them in quotes, and that's how he built my PSR. And my attorney sent it to me just this week and said, what needs to be edited? And I read it and I'm like, nothing.
Right. So think about that for a moment. What if the US government, when you were negotiating your plea agreement, said, hi, Justin, I'm David Willingham. I've indicted you. Sorry. Yes, we're you fellow USC graduates, but that doesn't change you created victims. But Justin, I'm going to give you the opportunity of a lifetime. I'm going to let you write the plea agreement. Would you like that opportunity? I said, yes, David, I would take that. Of course, they don't say that to you. I think you get what catch what I'm throwing here. They essentially let Gina write her probation report. Right. And so many of you reach out, my PSR sucks. They're recommending enhancements. They didn't recommend a downward departure. My substance abuse isn't clear. I had a bad knee. They didn't really disclose it. Am I not going to be in a lower bunk now? If you can write it, it's probably stronger. We encourage you to write it, to give it to them, because they're going to appreciate it and thank you for doing their job for them. Please write it. That's exactly what Gina did. And it's part of the reason she's like on a different trajectory from so many people who are told, including a couple of clients right now who are not on this webinar because in their PSR, if you knew the battling and fighting that we had with the counsel, good lawyers, the lawyer said, we cannot get this narrative to the probation officer. They didn't ask for it. Well, they're not going to ask for a release plan right now, but does that mean you don't give it to them? If you don't give it to them, what are they going to defer to? Your plea agreement that says you're a criminal who created victims? If you're not working to change the narrative, that's cool. Let others create the agenda or narrative. Your choice. Gina chose to go a different path. Chuck from my mom's home state of Minnesota. Good to see you. I mistakenly muted Chuck by mistake. Go ahead, Chuck. Go ahead.
All right. Just a real quick question, and I don't know how common this is, but I'm currently on pretrial probation. So I've been meeting with my probation officer on a regular basis. My sentencing is currently scheduled for September 22nd. I was told by him on at least 3 different occasions that he would also be my probation officer following the release. I was just curious how common that is.
It's not that common. It's happened. You're in Minnesota. I saw it in I've seen it in like North Dakota, New Hampshire. Kind of depends on the district and dual roles they may play. That's a good opportunity for you if you've been compliant, because he'll see the work that you've put in. If you go to prison, it will be a continuation of what you've seen. That I wish that was the case for most people, because they will have established that relationship with the probation officer over time. I frankly wish we saw more of that. So it's not that common, but I would argue because you've adjusted so well, it's been a good thing for you. Okay. Now, Joseph, back to you for a second. Joseph, as I understand it, you did share your work with your probation officer, and he's allowed you to come and do some work with our team. Is that correct? And do you think that was by accident, considering you also owe restitution?
Yeah, I explained to him everything about prison professors' white collar advice in detail. He actually went to the website. He went to my website too before meeting him. My wife had sent him the information when he did the home inspection. He actually read part of my narrative to me. He said, well, he didn't read it to me in the meeting. He said, how'd you get all that narrative into it? I said, I asked the interviewing officer. So he did read the narrative in the PSR. He read my personal website that I do with you guys. And for everyone on this call, just to recap, I had guideline sentence of 41 to 51 months. And I did everything Justin and Michael offered to me: website, narrative, PSR. They even helped me retain my lawyer. And it was nonstop work on my behalf. Like the judge says, we only factor in 1 or 2%. What your lawyer says is a paid mouthpiece. They want to see what you've done. And I was sentenced to 1 year and a day. I surrendered November 17th, 2022. And I was released on home confinement March 21st of this year. And he did approve it. He did say, I explained to him that I'm going to be, interacting, talking with felons, people with records. And I just simply explained the job. I took my time explaining everything, the company. I printed out the Michael being on the BOP website a few weeks ago. And he said, no problem. He said, no problem. He asked me what the sales part was. He says, what's this in your contract about sales? And I explained that to him. And he says, no problem. He says, great, go for it. He says, when you sign up for it, just, give me, when you start it up and the day one when you start. He goes, and just send me once a month your pay stubs or what you got paid for the month.
Perfect. All established when Joseph was in the pre-indictment stage, when he said, I'm going to lose my career as an investment advisor. I've got to rebuild, document, and build it. And here we are, I guess, 2 years later, Joseph, from phone call to here we are now. By the way, I did refer him to his lawyer in New York, Nicholas Kaiser, excellent lawyer in New York. One way that people get tripped up in that initial interview is the financials, and similar to the probation interview. Now, one thing I encourage all of you to do, if you owe restitution, if any of you borrow money, if people send you money in prison, you should document it, because you should list that as a debt that you're going to repay. And according to what the government would want you to do, you want to document the loan, actually record it, and establish some interest on it. What will freak them out is if you've borrowed money for legal fees or restitution, or some people borrow money to make a restitution payment to get a shorter sentence. You come home, you come into some money, and you disclose on your monthly financial that you sent $25,000 back to Grandpa Joe or your mom, and they freak out because they think you're hiding money. So if you've yet to go to prison, or even if your loved one's in prison, you should document what you've borrowed, get it notarized with an interest rate attached to it. Because if you come into money, or you're working and you want to pay mom and dad back, as I did, you have the record of it. It could be in the PSR, maybe not. If you borrowed the money before the PSR, disclose it. If it's post-sentencing, build into your release plan how you are borrowing money to rebuild your life, and you're grateful for that support, and you're going to work hard to pay them back. I've seen defendants, they're accepting responsibility and being transparent is key. Don't get me wrong. Some do it better than others, because some of you have remorse more than others. I get that. It's very nuanced. The financials is black and white. There ain't no gray with these people. And if they ever catch you lying, here's what they say. Exactly what a case manager said to someone in prison. What else are you hiding? I just found this out. It's not true. Why? They can read the emails. They listen to the phone calls. So you're inconsistent. Then they dive deeper if they find any inconsistency. So I'll quickly go through, even though this is very, very old, some of the questions they asked me. This is one of the...
Justin, quick question. Do you have a template for interfamily loan agreement?
I don't. You could probably just, Google it, or we can get something. It's just like a standard notary, like who loaned you the money, at what rate, on what date, what the repayment plan is. And I mean, we've had, years ago, we had a client whose parents gave him $2 million to pay restitution in full. But it's still, now he owes the money to his parents, and there could have been civil judgments that came from it, even though their DOJ had been paid. So you want to document it. I borrowed this money. It did keep him out of prison, I think. Pretty close to keeping him out of prison, if I recall. But yeah, you just want to be very clear in the record keeping, because they are cynical. They don't view you as I or your family views you. They just view you as someone, as a criminal. They view you by your plea agreement. So there should be this obsession of changing it, right? People in prison viewed Michael as a drug dealer, as a kingpin, who not only was a drug dealer, he didn't accept responsibility. He went to trial. I think the judge said, if you serve 300 years in prison, there's no way you can make amends. That was their perception of him. He worked to change it. You've got to do the same thing. So with respect to financials, they're going to ask basic questions, of course, but they are going to want all of your financial information, checking accounts, monthly inflow, cars. This seems pretty obvious, but every now and again, if you don't disclose something, they'll check the bank account. They'll look at your spending. They're going to look to see if you're opening or establishing LLCs without permission, because you will need permission to do these things. You will need permission if you go to Bed Bath & Beyond, which I guess now is out of business, and you apply for a card to get 10% off that day. You don't have permission to do that. We've had people get that call that said, why did you get a Bed Bath & Beyond card? It's like, I wanted $10 off the new toothbrush. No, you didn't have permission. These are technically violations. You've got to understand all of these things. I used to run into trouble with my probation officer because of this. List all expenditures over $500. I mean, come on, man. You know how expensive it is to live? Further, my book, Lessons from Prison, I didn't have a publisher. It was self-published. And this was really before Amazon print on demand. I would print 200 or 300 copies of the book, and it would be $3,000 or $4,000. He would go apoplectic when he saw the charge on my city card. And I had to continue to explain to him why I'm doing this, how investing in the book and producing it's going to lead to business. Here's my income this month. It was hard for him to view that entrepreneurial component to it. He just looked at the money that was going out. You need to express why you're spending money and how it's going to lead to a return. It got to a point where I spent too much, he said. He took me back in front of the judge, and the judge said I needed permission for any expenditure on a credit card of over $500 a month. Thankfully, I was nearly done with probation. But when you owe restitution, they want all of the money to go there. One thing they will ask you, and if anyone has had this, you should let me know. Has anyone been asked, hey, I see you have some liquid assets, give it all to us? Anyone on probation where they've said that to you? Oh, hi, I saw you have $18,000 in, I was going to say Bank of America, but B of A would have fired you already if you're a felon. I see you have $18,000 in your checking account. Give it all to us. Has that happened to any of you? Anyone? It happened to me. And I want you to know how to respond if you turn in financials and they say that you have some liquidity and they want all of it. You've got to be able to say what I said. As I expressed in my plan, I'm a convicted felon. I'm unhireable. I lost my licenses. I've ruined my reputation. I owe hundreds of thousands of dollars to victims and to my parents. And I'm grateful to have a few resources. I made a contribution to restitution at sentencing, but I cannot be penniless or homeless. And I don't think it's unrealistic to think that I should have some resources to build a business. I am committed to making my restitution payment. And if and when I'm successful, I'll send in more money. But no, I don't plan to turn all of my money over. Some people do, they get scared. But you've got to be able to articulate the collateral consequences of your conviction. If you're unable to do that, you're weaker. And that aligns with what a federal judge said at a sentencing conference. Judge Boulware said at a conference in San Diego, defendants are weaker if they just express the only consequence is prison. I know it is not, because I know you white-collar people are not going to a penitentiary. You're going to a prison camp. So he said, you serve yourselves well if you articulate all of the collateral consequences of your conviction, including to your probation officer, which is why you shouldn't take the last 9 cents that I have. Now, you can be strategic if you begin to make money and send more. It builds goodwill. I always did that. I knew that it was of higher value to travel and have more liberty because of the scrutiny that I was beginning to get in this business. That said, Melinda, your hand is still up. Or are there any other questions that I'm not covering before we proceed?
Justin, can I?
Go ahead.
Go, Melinda.
Thank you. I just had a quick question. I did pose it to everybody, but if restitution is fully paid, is this financial part still carry the same weight? Am I still going to need to be sharing this information, getting permission, etc.?
Thank you for making us all feel bad that yours is paid off and ours is not. Thank you, Melinda. Just kidding.
I'm sorry.
I'm kidding.
Hypothetically.
It's wonderful. Someone can tell me differently. We still have people filling out the financials, even if restitution is paid, right?
Okay.
They still want it. It's still a part of the process. You do have a higher likelihood of getting off probation early if it's paid, even being able to travel personally if it's paid, less scrutiny over the job that you may want, including maybe not even working at all, even though you should if you would like to. If you're retired, you might not have to. So I think you still have to turn in the financials, honestly, but you're not going to have that level of scrutiny that I had or Joseph or others have if you owe money. Is anyone here who had their restitution paid in full and still did the financials for probation? I suspect you do.
Yes, you have to.
Right, there you go. So they just won't scrutinize it to the degree that they would elsewhere, but it makes your life easier if it's paid.
Justin, can you speak for a couple minutes on if there's a concurrent civil judgment for restitution? So not restitution, but a civil judgment by the company or a third party, and how that works with restitution?
So I discussed that with my probation officer because I had a civil lawsuit that had been settled. And he said, here's the deal. The number one priority is criminal restitution. Even clients that have had settlements with the Securities Exchange Commission, where they get like the double whammy, they get the disgorgement, and you should fight, by the way, to try to get that removed. If you're going to prison, you have the restitution. Either way, they're going to view it as number one priority as the victims of the court and restitution above all else. They're not going to want to see payments going to a civil settlement. All of it should go to restitution. And it's frustrating, by the way. We had someone who have sent like $400,000 to restitution. A year and a half later, it still hasn't been dispersed to the victims. It's a slow bureaucracy. That's not your job. Do the best you can. But yes, their primary focus is going to be criminal restitution, including a client that wanted to settle a civil case. And the probation officer is like, if you have money to settle there, you have money to give to your victims. That's of higher value.
But then are you double paying then? Because if it's the same company, so if let's say it's one victim, you owe $10 million in restitution, the victim sues you civilly, you have a consent judgment for 10 million. Do you double pay, or does the restitution then go towards that civil judgment?
So like in my case, for example, all the victims ultimately settled. All the victims settled with UBS and me. And per that settlement, they were going to get paid back by the court-ordered restitution. They were not going to get paid twice. They're not going to get the double whammy here. That was my experience. That's how it should be, but they shouldn't get paid twice. Some agreements will state, I want the settlement to also cover legal fees, because if lawyers get involved and settle it, they may get a third of that, which could be less to the victims. These are all things that can be worked out. To your question, the probation officer is primarily concerned with the victims. Now, what I want to stress before I go to more questions is staying inside your travel restriction. And I violated this one time, and I actually called the probation officer and said, hey man, I made a mistake. They're going to tell you where you can travel without permission. I was in Los Angeles, so you could see I can go to San Luis, Santa Barbara, Ventura, LA, Orange County, Riverside, and San Bernardino. Technically, if you go outside of this area, you need permission. And one time I went to speak to a school, and it was like just outside Riverside. And why did I notify him? Thinking he'll probably never find out, because if I get a speeding ticket or a parking ticket, they're going to immediately be notified and they can run a check. And with that check could come problems and a violation. So I self-reported, hey, Mr. Murrow, I made a mistake. I thought I was in the county of Riverside. Apparently I'm not. I wanted to notify you immediately. And he just said, that's fine. Thanks for telling me. The problem is if you don't notify him about contact with law enforcement. The problem is if you don't notify him that you've traveled without permission and they find out on their own. We're human beings. We make mistakes. It's when we cover it up, pretend it didn't happen, and they find out on their own, where you've destroyed all of the hard work. Sorry, excuse me, where you've destroyed all of the hard work that you've put in. Okay. Any other questions?
Hey, Justin, this is Brian Cisco. How you doing?
Good to see you, Brian.
Hey, I just wanted to touch in on the restitution part. You know, I had no restitution in my case and still had to do financials. Also about early release, I wanted to touch on that. I think you and I had discussed my personal experience with that. I don't know if this is a good time to kind of put that in, or if we can save it for another.
Yeah, no, we'll do it 2 times. Before we wrap up this webinar, give me a couple of minutes on, please, we'd love to listen for you. I know you had a wonderful experience. I've known Brian for many years. Let's hear it.
So when I came out, I was one of the COVID early releases. I was actually one of the first ones that got out. I was at the camp in Millington, Tennessee. And I was one of the first that they let out BOP-wide. for the COVID, because, you know, I had 24-month sentence and everything else. I mean, I was set to go to the halfway house in 5 months anyway. So they went ahead and let me out, did 7 months on home confinement with the ankle bracelet. You know, when I first got to the halfway house, they said that my paperwork was for the halfway house, not to go direct to home confinement. And they were going to try to force me to stay there. And so luckily, I called the residential reentry management house in Nashville. They recognized the mistake and got mad at me for calling them, but they fixed it and I was able to get home. It was a comedy of errors, as you would expect dealing with bureaucrats and whatnot. But, you know, for the early release part, I had 2 years of supervised release. At approaching the 12-month mark of my supervised release here in the Sixth Circuit, you know, I read up on the local rules of court and everything, and my probation officer has to put me in for, you know, early termination. I asked my PO about it, and he said, sure, he wouldn't have a problem with that, but let's just wait until after the holidays, because nobody, you know, works during the holidays anyways, because my off date was December 10th of this past year, 2022. So we're looking at, you know, 2021. I'm asking him about this to get in front of it. So he kicks the can down the road. I call him right after the first of the year last year, and he is pulling me up in the system, and he goes, oh, wait, you're not even on my caseload anymore. He didn't even know. I had been transferred to a new PO, didn't even know. So he puts me in touch with the PO. The first thing that PO does is get on my case for not turning in my probation reports, because I was emailing them. You know, I use Adobe DC Pro, so I had it in PDF and would just fill it out and send it in. They have a website that you go into to log into the BOP if you're on supervised release. My PO, the first one, didn't want it that way. He wanted them emailed. This one looked in the system, didn't see them, and was about to violate me because I hadn't had any reports on file. And did not matter that I hadn't got the letter notifying me that they were my new officer. None of that mattered. And so I said, you know, I called my old PO back and said, will you call this PO? I said, I've got the emails, you know, I've got the confirmations and everything of these reports, and help me out. Thank goodness my PO did, because I mean, not even had met me or anything, and they were trying to violate me right off the bat.
Again, thank you. And I've known Brian now for about 5 years. It's good to see you, Brian. We did a little media work together back in 2018.
Yes, sir.
So it comes down to what we had said earlier. It's a very subjective process. One case manager is going to be kind and responsive. Another may have a bad day, think that you've had it too easy, may look at the PSR and say you got too short of a sentence. Who knows? They may just feel like their job is to punish rather than rehabilitate. You just endure it to the extent that you can be preparing for all of these things. You're stronger. You're preparing for objections. I don't know if Don's son is going to turn in 50 of his newsletters to his probation officer, but what he should do, provide a summary of what he did while in prison, provide a sample of what he was producing, and help the probation officer understand why he was so productive in prison, what he has been doing to avoid problems, why he'll be compliant. It's what all of you should do. Again, 99% of the work should be done at that interview, no different from your probation interview. It's the work you do on a daily basis that begins to change the narrative, rather than telling them, you show them, and be authentic and be vulnerable. I mean, if there are people who reach out to Scott and me and say like, man, I don't have my plan yet, then be authentic. It's okay if you don't have your plan. You feel like your life is destroyed, you're going to prison, you've lost your career, your network could be forgetting about you. You don't figure it all out day one, but if you can begin to lay out a vision and start, only then you can pivot. That is the key here. But if it's this, I'm a felon, no one will hire me, I come back to how I opened the call from that banker who served 27 months. He's like, well, it sounded very cliche, like right out of a TV show. Like, I'm in prison. I was in prison. Now I'm in another prison. It's like, dude, you didn't serve 39 years in prison. You were in a camp for 17 months. I mean, let's acknowledge that. Okay, please. But it comes down to preparation. We're always going to be honorable and tell you the truth, even if you don't want to hear it. Your release plan is not a get out of jail free card. You've got to build it. And everything else you've got to build and do the work. That's why you should be reading Michael's journals every day, Prison Professor Talent. Mr. Carper, I saw your hand, please. Or Dawn. I've been reprimanded to call you Dawn. I'm sorry. Dawn, I'm here.
At about the 14th or 15th week, the probation officer came to the house for a house visit. I asked her at the time if she would mind getting Scott's newsletter. She said that would be great. So she's been getting them over half the time that they've been sent.
Yeah. And think about how cool that is. I mean, his PO is reading it. I'll also share another strategy with you that really helped me on probation. And this comes back to, I wrote a little book, Scott and everyone is helping. I wrote a little book on reputation management, repairing your reputation if you've endured a felony conviction, and something I cover in the book. I'll distribute more of this next week, but I'm sharing this with you for a reason. I'll share the book next week. I'm reading a chapter every day as a podcast, Rebuilding Your Reputation After White Collar Crime Conviction. One thing I cover in there is the value of public speaking and contributing and giving back. Now, I did it for free for a while to grow my skill set to speak, to develop my network, because you never know who's going to be in that audience to help you. And something that so many people in our community have done is go to their pretrial services officer who supervised you. Many districts have like classes for pretrial for like where we are right now in the pretrial services stage. So in Los Angeles, the district court was called Keys to Successful Incarceration. It's actually a course that Michael Santos wrote in prison, sent to a pretrial services officer, Cameron Pitcher, who is the chief pretrial services officer in Los Angeles and Riverside. And I said, and he reached out to me in prison, and I came home and I've spoke to that class 10 times. Joseph, Scott, any of you, Scott Seek, if it's the right message, reach out to that district, say, hey, when I was on pretrial, I could have used this information. I'd love to come and speak and talk productively about prison, preparing for sentencing, very optimistic, how to avoid pitfalls in prison. We've had, I don't know, a dozen or so clients over the years call their pretrial service office and say, yeah, come and speak. Build it into your release plan. Build into your release plan that you join this webinar and contribute to impact justice impacted people. And it's good to give back. You hone your speaking skills, you share with your probation officer. But I loved doing that. It feels good to give back and contribute. You're doing that every week anyway. But these are things you can do to kind of separate yourself, and you never know what opportunity will come from it. Okay. But it requires, you know, the right message. The right message. Okay. Brian, your hand was still up. I think we spoke with you. I do want to do a simultaneous, I think I want to cover next week part of our webinar. We've done it before, but there are new ones upcoming, common probation violations and how they happen and how to respond to them, the consequences that could follow. I'm going to do a YouTube short, I think today, about a guy who's been off probation for 3 years. He refinanced. Here's the story. Interest rates are higher. The property was in his wife's name. They couldn't refinance. They needed his income. He went on the loan to refinance. The feds found out, I should say the IRS was notified, and they seized the refinance. They took the proceeds. It's like, remember that Rockwell song with Michael Jackson? I feel like someone's watching me. Who's next? The IRS? Yes, they're always watching. They're always here. He'd been off probation for 3 years, forgot that the financial litigation unit, which we'll discuss a little bit more next week, right? We talked about this. I'll share this with you again. If you owe cash, right, you're going to get this from the financial litigation unit every year or two. I'd been off probation since 2012. They sent this to me in 2018. Then they sued me and took me back to court till I settled. Every couple of years, this is coming, and they're watching. You want to know how I know? Because I spoke with Bob Lester, who works for the financial litigation unit. And you know what he does all day? He looks at how much you've been paying, where you are. He Googles you to see if you're on TV or making money or starting new businesses or refinancing. That is their job, to collect for victims. They took all the refinance. Terrible, awful. But the government would argue, what do you expect? You have liquid resources. You still owe money to your victims. This is justice. You told the judge you were sorry. You wanted to make amends. Give us the money. They're always watching. Don't think when you're done with probation, it's over. It's 2 decades. And by the way, you may have victims calling. That's oftentimes how they stay on top of you. That happened with Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street, right? You got Leonardo playing you in a movie. You owe $112 million in restitution. You're driving a Lamborghini and you think it's cool to not pay them. The victims were calling the U.S. Attorney's Office and saying, are you people nuts? Where's our money? They're always watching. Yep.
I have a quick question about restitution, if possible.
Yes.
So in my plea agreement, I agreed for the restitution. Big portion of it was for profit that I made on sales, and some of it was for fines. I don't have any victims. Do I have to pay restitution for the profits that I made on, like, you know, what they were charging me for, or just the fines that that I have to pay?
That's going to be in your plea agreement, right? You should know before it should be resolved before sentencing. If you have a fine, if you owe restitution, if there's a forfeiture, how much, that's a question you have for your lawyer, and that should all be coordinated in advance. It's stunning how many people call our team and say, like, hey, I got a year and a day, but like in my judgment and commitment order, it states that I owe like $473,000. What's that? I'm like, oh, that's called criminal restitution. Well, what is that? You signed a plea agreement, you've been sentenced, you don't know, they're coming. So these are questions for your lawyer. Also, you can ask when it comes to restitution. My lawyer should have asked the Judge Wilson, not to apply interest on my restitution. They didn't, and my restitution was only $500. I'm not saying that's not a lot of money, but relative to some people, it's nothing. But it ran every year at 1.66%, and I ended up paying it in full, and that was a lot of money because it took me 11 years. So a number of defendants' lawyers will ask the court not to apply interest on the restitution, and I think most of the time the judge will say, okay, that's something my lawyer should have done. Also, I don't want to freak you out. Sometimes the judge may say 5% of your income or $1,000 a month, whichever is greater. They do that because they believe it, but if you come home and you don't have it, they're not going to take it. It's why you go through a detailed financial worksheet, okay? And things of that nature. Also, there have been some issues over the years where if your bank fires you and you come into some resources, maybe that money goes to your brother or your wife, you need to document why that money went there. My bank fired me. Nobody wants my business. I'm in federal prison. I have nowhere to put the money. For that reason, I had to put it into my wife's account, or I couldn't cash the check. Right? You want to think these things through. We had someone in our community who was a successful real estate agent, and about 4 months after he went to prison, he came into a $150,000 commission. And he's like, oh my God, I owe restitution. They're going to take all of it. I said, hold on, what's the right message here? How long did you work on that deal? 9 months. Okay, well, when you extrapolate $150,000 over 9 months, that's how much you earned over that window. Did you have expenses? Yes. You didn't make 150 grand in one day. You've been working. Convey the right message to your probation officer. They might not think like you as an entrepreneur or a business person. Their job is, I see money, I want to get it to the victims. This is part of the value of learning, planning, thinking, documenting it. But if any of you, God help you, want to become an entrepreneur, and if you don't build it on that release plan, nothing wrong with KFC. That's where they send you to the halfway house in Hollywood. Nothing wrong with KFC. But I think you all want to do something different. I know I did, and it's okay to say that. Don't be ashamed. You want to do something different. It won't happen by accident. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. And any other questions, Scott? I see you. I see a few hands up. Scotty, you there, Scott? Yes.
Yes, I'm here, just responding to some things in the
Oh,
chat.
no, not you, Scott. Last Scott. I know you
Oh,
like
Scott
all these
Seek.
checks.
All right, Scott Seek.
There are other Scotts.
No.
The webinar. Okay.
Hey, Scott, drop me an email, please. Yeah, one question, Justin, and I come out of the securities arena. And when the SEC garners monies and fines and whatever, which isn't applicable here in my white collar crime, but those victims never get any money. It's just confiscated by Uncle Sam and applied to the SEC's operating budget.
It fills their coffers.
Yeah. So my question is, in the context of a restitution payment, and I have a large one, do you actually believe any of that money ever makes it back to quote unquote those victims?
I know it does. It takes time. I know that it does, but there is a bureaucracy and timeline behind it that is very unsettling for victims. And I've discussed that with some government employees where they say, look, prosecutors, like, my job is to get the number. My job isn't to collect. That's a different department, right? And the person in that department will say, okay, we're collecting, we're gonna disperse. It just takes time. I mean, I know that victims are often they talk about the victims. The prosecutors talk about the victims on TV and when they do media and at a sentencing hearing, but they often tend to be forgotten about. I mean, the whole sentencing issue is it really so much of what Michael Santos is advocating for with the prison reform work that he's doing. You know, we're involved in the First Step Act. We want more to come. We believe if the victims are truly the priority, then Scott Seek and Scott Laney and others should be home working to earn a living and pay restitution. If you have to go back and sleep at the prison, fine, but work furloughs, things of that nature, we think are coming. We want to come. That's what we're advocating for. But if that does come, who's going to qualify? Only the people that have earned it, that are ready in a position to benefit from it. So to your point, I totally agree with you, Scott. It's frustrating. It's ridiculous. It's kind of at times I don't want to say a money grab, but even, you know, when people plead guilty and we saw that in the Varsity Blues case. We had clients, no restitution, but because they have resources, they hit them with a $250,000 fine. It's an opportunity for them to get some cash.
In my case, one of my co-defendants who, she's out, he's still in, but that's neither here nor there. You know, we're dealing in the multi-million-dollar range. He had his restitution low. I got sentenced first in this context. He got sentenced after me, but in doing so, we finally had access to all of the victims and all of the data and all of the database. And, you know, I spent like 120 man hours auditing the victims' claims. And bear with me 1 second. Halfway house.
That's how it works, people. This is live. This isn't recorded.
This is live. I'm at home.
See, it's happening. That was a 3-second phone call. They just want to confirm you were alive and you picked up.
And what the stupid thing is, I've got an ankle bracelet, so they know bloody well where I am. Or they'll call my wife at home when they know I'm at work. Okay, so
it's all part of the journey. More to come is what we.
How about when they call you at 2 a.m. and wonder where you are?
Yes, they do the 2 a.m. call.
Let me go back to the restitution. So anyway, I spent, like an auditor, I went through 2,200 they sent out 22,000 letters. They get 2,200 back. They come up with a figure of, they come back with like $9 million. They disallowed like whatever, and they come up with 8.2. Okay. So I then take their data, their database, and using everything that they gave to defense attorneys, I did the work for the defense attorneys. Bottom line was, I came up with basically $2.5 million of fraudulent claims. One example of that was, woman says, here's my husband's death certificate. I think he lost $200,000, and I think he invested in these 10 stocks.
Yep.
Well, originally that was part of the 8-point-some million. And then after my audit and going through everybody who lost more than 1,000, I came up with almost $2.5 million of fraudulent claims. Fraudulent, erroneous claims, wrong stock, wrong dates, wrong company, whatever. Well, that's a big chunk of money. Now, my co-defendant who got sentenced after me had his reduced by the amount that I had audited. So his was reduced back down to 6. Mine has not been reduced. And I'm not sure where to turn. So I may have to ask you who to maybe ask where to go with that.
So let me get some clarity on something. At this point, are you saying you don't feel your restitution number is correct?
That's correct.
Yes. Hate to be the bearer of bad news. I've never seen anyone at this stage of the journey get it amended or corrected, because
even if my co-defendant got the number at sentencing.
Well, no, the number should be whatever has been paid or contributed. It should be reduced. It will be reduced by that amount, and it should be. But
no. My question is, if my co-defendant who had the exact same restitution initially, I get sentenced, and since I was sentenced first, I'm just using a round number, 8. But his attorney kept working on the number after we had basically
already been. So you've been sentenced, but the restitution amount based on his sentencing and other research should be lower.
Correct.
Right. So okay.
Match is.
Yeah. So again, what I would do is request the court to appoint you a public defender to kind of manage this, because you want to go back in front of the judge. I'm not a lawyer here. I'm just going based on some experience here, to amend the restitution order because it is inaccurate. But you can do it on your own, have a lawyer, but you want an opportunity to get in front of them to let them know the number is incorrect. The number should be different.
Okay.
Most of the time, and this is what really freaks a lot of people out, they don't even know what the number is or how they got there, and they go to a sentencing hearing. Now, I will tell you, many people, including me, don't agree with the restitution amount. Like Scott, I didn't agree with my number, and my lawyer said to me, hey, we've gotten about 300 off. We're not going to get any lower. Take it or leave it. The U.S. attorney says this is the deal. And if you don't agree with the government, the judge is going to make the decision. We have had people get sentenced and the restitution is still unclear. They'll serve their prison term and then come home and have a restitution hearing if it's not resolved. Generally, I think the court would like to see it resolved the day of sentencing. But these are, if it's incorrect, Scott, you want to advocate for yourself and say, here's why. It's a lot of money. Okay. And I know you're not afraid to do the work. Okay, Angie and then Dusko.
Hi, sorry, you guys were talking about the co-defender and how the restitution wasn't all that. If it's unfair, I just want to make sure I understood. If it's unfair, then you could just go back to the judge and see what they can do if it's among like 3 co-defenders, you could figure out what it should be.
I wouldn't say unfair. The government is going to propose a number.
Right.
The onus is on you and your lawyer to try to advocate and articulate why you think the number should be different. I'm articulating that after sentencing, it's very difficult to have that number adjusted or changed because you've been sentenced, you've agreed to it. And if you look at your judgment and commitment order, it's going to be posted in there, for example. And it's surprising how many people don't even read their judgment and commitment order, but it's listed. Here's my judgment and commitment order right here. There I am, February 25th, 2008, was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison with my lawyer present. In terms of my sentence, had to pay $100 special assessment. There's my co-defendant who got 5 years. I presume it's in here somewhere.
What if
What it says that I owe this $500,000 that's joint and several. So it's going to be listed in your judgment and commitment order. Okay. And the judge is going to sign it. It's very hard to change that. So you might not agree with it. That's what your lawyers are advocating and fighting for. Oh, here it is right here.
Okay.
Defendant, it's going to be in here. This is a court document. Defendant shall pay in restitution in the total amount of $510,378 to victims as set forth in the separate victim list prepared by the probation office, as laid out in the government's position paper 8 and 9, which this court adopts and which reflects the court's determination of restitution due each victim. I mean, this is the judgment and commitment order. Good luck getting that changed. I hope Scott prevailed very hard. It needs to be resolved before your sentencing.
Okay, because this is for my boyfriend. He was sentenced, but then he didn't know the other 2 co-defenders when they were going to be sentenced because it wasn't no one knew anything. We were just doing he was just doing what he knew and what was being done for him. So that's why I was wondering about the restitution, because he wasn't understanding the restitution because his restitution was fairly high compared to when he found out about the other 2.
What I would encourage him to do if he's in custody is immediately begin writing his release plan. And then 2, you or him ask his lawyer for his judgment and commitment order, which will then articulate how much in restitution he owes, who his co-defendants are. And in time, you'll get updates from the U.S. Attorney's Office like 2 years late, indicating how much of it has been paid. I would never reach out to them. And there are people in prison who are bored, who are looking to stir up trouble for some reason. Like, hey, I want to know how much I've paid. Who cares? Because if you reach out to them, you know what it does? It may say, oh, this guy's looking for asking questions. Maybe he has money. Let's do an audit of his financials. It's just dumb.
Right.
Okay, but people do it.
Thank
Gordon,
you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining our community. And if you'd like us to send a copy of Earning Freedom to your boyfriend, send a direct message to Scott Laney with your email. We'll coordinate that. All of you have an opportunity to get big book, but you'll see that release plan in action. Gordon, good to see you, my friend. What's the question?
I was going to just state about restitution in the Ninth Circuit. I know of a case where the Ninth Circuit actually ordered the judge and said that the judge has full responsibility to make sure he gets the number correct on the restitution. So you can use that as leverage to make sure the judge gets it right.
Scott, that's helpful for you. Gord just mentioned something in the Ninth Circuit about ensuring restitution is accurate. So I know you'll do your research, but that could be a good place to start.
The
Thank you.
burden is on the judge. The burden's on the court.
Got it. That's right. That's right. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Gord. All right, cool. Great interactive webinar. I'm so grateful. Is there any other questions or topics before we wrap up? Anything, by the way, before we go that you'd like us to cover? I do want to touch a little more on probation next week and probation violations. But while we're here, is there anyone that has specific questions you'd like us to cover? First Step Act, preparing for prison, disciplinary infractions, working with your lawyer. Anything
the amendments to the First Step Act that are going into effect November 1st.
We'll cover that next week. You have my word. We'll get some insights on that and how some lawyers are working to delay sentencing with hopes that we'll talk about that. Michael's working on a very thorough webinar for prison professors talent that you'll all want to benefit from. So we got the amendment. Anything else?
I got a question.
Yep.
On my situation, I've basically been on the run for the last 14 years as of now. And for me, I've been living in Mexico for 14 years. So I violated federal probation, but there's no warrant. I crossed back over the border without any type of verification. I called my attorney while he was a public defender, and he says he can't find any warrants for my arrest. I took out from a halfway house, and I've been living here in Mexico for the last 14 years. And I got a whole different new identity and everything like that. So I'm a whole different person here.
It sounds that way. Let me jump in for a moment because we've done 50 of these webinars and I've seen just about everything, including this. I want to be helpful, though, of course, your identity is seen here because this is being recorded. Anyone can see it. What's this? I think in a different call, I'd love to know why, if you were in the halfway house, you left. We could discuss that separately. But what's the specific question to ensure that I'm giving you the right information? Because what I am not is a lawyer.
My question is, why is there no warrant for my arrest?
Again, no, that's a good question. I am not a lawyer. I can't answer that question. Could they have forgotten about you? Maybe. I don't know how big a deal it was. Maybe it exists and you don't know about it. I don't know if it was federal, state, or local. I don't know. I know the U.S. government's smart and they have a lot of resources. And sometimes when people feel they're forgotten about, they go into the country and just like that, they're in detention. So there's this. Yeah, I don't know.
On my case, look, the U.S. Marshals were looking for me. And they went to my uncles, tapped their phones. I mean, they did a whole lot of crazy stuff because I was, I was basically crossing stuff through the border.
I get all that. And I don't know if it's in your interest to share what the details were. What I can do, what I can do is unfortunately not answer your question other than making something up, which doesn't help any of us. I have no idea.
No, I just want to get an idea, basically, because
here's my answer. I have no, I wish I had the idea. I don't, and I'm sorry. And I'm sorry you've been enduring this for 14 years as a consequence of crossing the border, but I hope you make good decisions.
Well, look, my main thing is I'm kind of curious why there's nothing like U.S. Marshals just completely dropped everything.
Again, I have no idea. I know, I have, while I strive to provide value with this topic, I'm utterly useless. I have nothing to contribute.
Okay, well,
But thanks, but I appreciate you sharing. Any other topics or questions? I see people discussing we should talk more about halfway house and home confinement, early termination of probation. So let's do that next week. We'll talk about common probation violations that Scott and I continue to get phone calls on. We'll talk about halfway house and home confinement, getting the right job lined up, sort of the pettiness that also exists in the halfway house and how that could lead to problems. Maybe even go through what an example of an early termination letter look like that someone in our community has used to try to get support from their probation officer. So we'll talk a little bit more about life after prison and any other questions, of course, that come up.
Justin, what's really helpful is hearing things that don't go well in prison.
Yeah.
So like the don'ts,
Sure.
walking out of the chow hall with an apple because you think you want to save it for later. Just small things like that I think are really, really helpful.
All right, so we'll cover some of those things as well. We haven't done real active prison preparation for a little while. We'll talk about that. I know on the emotional level that the don'ts and things to avoid trigger people, and that, so we'll get that. I can relate to that, because if you do get into trouble, it could derail the whole release plan. So let's do that then. We'll do a hybrid, or we'll conflate some prison planning, things not to do, halfway house, home confinement job, early termination, and struggles that people continually get into while on probation. That will be the, and by the way, if anyone wants to read Mr. Don's son's newsletter, send him an email. He'll put you on the distribution list. It's awesome. And it's awesome. That's why it's awesome. That's the best way I'm going to describe it. Anything else before we wrap up? Any questions not answered or covered?
Hey, Michael, any chance you can talk about getting less probation time, right? So like trying to resolve that issue up front.
That's a sentencing issue. Most defendants get 3 years probation. We've had 2 people in our community get 0, both in the great state of Wisconsin, ironically enough. Nobody really gets 0, some 1, 2, or 3. It's usually 3. That's kind of up to the judge, right? I know I was at a sentencing hearing, it was Judge Gutierrez tell the defendant, you've been compliant on pretrial for 4 years. You haven't had any problems. I'm going to give you 1 year of supervision, because he'd kind of been on supervision for 4 years successfully. So a lot of it depends on pretrial, how you are, but some judges are just like, I do 3 years. Some judges are like, I don't recommend RDAP. Some judges say, I will. Some probation officers say, I don't care how compliant you are. I'm not going to recommend you get off early if you owe probation. So some have their set policies, but it doesn't mean your lawyer in their sentencing memorandum shouldn't argue why you should get 2 years or 1 year of supervision versus 3. We would argue your own advocacy is going to compel the judge to do that rather than just a request. But the record you build on pretrial should influence that. Good?
Justin, I have a quick question.
Yep.
It's about the reduction as far as the First Step Act. So if in subtracting like the 54 days a year, and then subtracting the credits that you can earn under First Step Act, let's just say somebody is showing that they should have a release date after 12 months or something. And then does part of that, can they also go home for home confinement or go to a halfway house?
Are you talking about the reduction?
Yeah.
The amendment that's
wait.
coming this fall?
Well, no, I was just trying to figure out, like, is home confinement part of that 12 months, or is it, hey, you?
Oh, yeah. So if you were to get a year in the halfway house, is home confinement part of that?
Right.
Yeah, the answer is yes. Right. So
Okay.
yes, and we'll go through some of the math that the BOP uses, like 10% of your sentence. We'll go through that next week.
Okay.
But there is someone in our community, Hugo Mejia. Many of you know, Hugo got a 36-month sentence at Sheridan. He was home in 9.5 months. The consequence of the only downside of that is he got like 11 months in the halfway house. And they told him, you have got to be, we want you here for at least 7 months. So we're going to send you to home confinement in October. Right. So you get much more time in the halfway house / home confinement. The downside is you may end up spending more time in the halfway house. Whereas if you get shorter halfway house time, you're going to spend less time in the halfway house, more time on home confinement because you serve more time in prison. We'll go through some of those nuances next week, but yes, it is a portion of the overall number.
Okay. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Okay. Let's see. I'm surprised nobody called me prison man after that video I filmed. I got the text message from Melinda. Okay. Any other questions before we wrap up the
Justin, can you give just a 2-minute highlight on what the amendment is that's coming in the fall?
That's a big negative. That's a big negative, but we'll do 60 minutes on it next week. I need a little bit more time to review and study it and kind of make sure that we're giving the accurate information, but I can assure you we will cover it next week.
Got it.
Anything else? Saw the Mission Impossible movie, by the way. Fantastic. Highly encourage it if you want to get out with the family for the weekend. Don't forget, we're not in prison yet. I acted like I was in prison before I went to prison. A lot of regrets. So you're home, you're healthy, you're strong. Enjoy this time. Who knows what's going to come, but use this time productively. Spend time with your family. Anything else? Joseph, I love that background, by the way. You look like Elon Musk. Anything? There we go. There we go. Okay, everyone, you're wonderful. We're going to see you next week. We've already established the agenda. Gina, as always, your contributions are awesome. And actually, before we go, we just got an email from text message from someone in our community who had their PSR. The call went really great. It was an hour long. Then I spent several. Okay, another good PSR. That's my wife calling me from Atlanta. Okay, have a wonderful week, everyone. We're going to see you next Thursday. I'm going to get this recording up on YouTube in just a little bit. Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
joining.
Thank you very
Scott.
much.
Thank
Great
you,
webinar. Thanks for
Justin.
contributing. Bye-bye.